Before we begin, please be aware that this podcast contains discussion of sensitive topics, such as abuse of minors, of vulnerable adults, and safeguarding practices. Some content may be distressing or triggering for listeners. This program is intended for an adult audience. If you or someone you know is affected by these issues, we encourage you to seek support from a trusted professional or a local support service. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to this 10th episode of Inside Safeguarding, the official podcast of the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. From Rome, I'm William Roberts from the Commission's communications team. Each month, we bring you a reflective look at the Commission's work, conversations on safeguarding as they evolve, and a deeper insight into the wider challenges facing the Church today. And let's begin, as we always do, with a look at this month's developments. This month offers an interesting insight into how safeguarding is developing across different parts of the Church. What emerges is less a single unified program and more a web of commitments that take shape in different contexts. We begin in Brazil, where a newly signed memorandum has given fresh energy to safeguarding efforts within the local church. Now, a memorandum can easily appear procedural at first. Yet here, its significance lies in the way it connects different actors with a shared responsibility. Church authorities, safeguarding professionals, and civil partners are brought into closer alignment. That collaboration isn't only reserved for the internal framework. It indicates a readiness to interact more broadly in the external society of which the Church is a part. Safeguarding depends on this openness. When our institutions are willing to be seen, interrogated, and supported by others, that strength grows. So what does this actually mean in practice? Well, the agreement intends to implement better training, better reporting systems, and more consistency across dioceses. But there is a larger change in approach that's hiding under these concrete steps. The notion of safeguarding is interinstitutional, with responsibilities being recognized as extending beyond institutional denominationalism. So from Brazil, we turn to Italy, specifically here in Rome, where recent reflection has focused on how safeguarding itself is understood. A story we published earlier this month invites a reconsideration of the language commonly used in this field. It suggests that safeguarding can't be reduced to definitions or procedural categories alone. Relationships shape how safeguarding is lived in practice. Now, while that may appear to be a small change, the consequences are huge. Because while definitions per se may help to clarify both public discourse and political approaches, it is in framing the relationships between people that determines whether people feel comfortable speaking up about their situation and whether structures of care act upon with heart. In an Italian context, this rethink brought a renewed focus on formation. There's a growing understanding that safeguarding is about relationships, and particularly to do with the adult-child care situations of vulnerability. It beckons to diligence and accountability rooted in a reverence for human dignity. That doesn't eliminate the need for structures of policy, of course. Its focus is on how that structure plays out in the day-to-day. It begs the question whether safeguarding exists in everyday interactions or whether it lives separately in formal rituals. From Europe, we move to Southern Africa, where a recent workshop organised in collaboration with IMBISA, that's the Interregional Meeting of Bishops of South Africa, brought together safeguarding practitioners from across the region. The focus here was on strengthening capacity. Participants exchanged experiences and worked through practical challenges together. Areas such as case management and prevention were explored in depth, alongside ways of supporting those who have been harmed. What stands out in this context is the importance of regional cooperation. Many of the countries involved face similar constraints, including limited resources and wide geographical distances. Working together allows them to share knowledge and support one another in ways that would otherwise be difficult to achieve alone. The workshop also highlighted the need for continuity. Safeguarding develops over time. Training must be revisited and adapted. Relationships among practitioners need to be sustained if progress is to continue. In this sense, the IMBISA initiative reflects a broader principle. Safeguarding depends on connections between people and institutions, extending across dioceses and national borders. And this theme continues in another development for this month, as the Commission deepened its collaboration with bishops from across Asia in preparation for the upcoming annual report. These members form part of an ongoing process of dialogue and accompaniment. Bishops are invited to reflect on their local contexts, to share experiences, and to contribute to a wider understanding of safeguarding across the continent. Asia, in this respect, presents a very diverse landscape. Cultural and social factors shape how safeguarding is perceived and implemented. In some areas, awareness is still emerging. In others, more developed systems are already in place. The Commission's engagement in this context is centered on listening. It seeks to understand local realities and to support responses that are grounded in those realities. At the same time, these conversations contribute directly to the annual report, ensuring that it reflects lived experience rather than a series of abstract models. They also help to foster a sense of shared responsibility across the global church. Local churches are able to see their own efforts in relation to others, recognizing both common challenges and distinct contexts. And finally, we turn to South Africa, where a safeguarding workshop focused on religious women addressed both the reality of abuse and the question of resilience. This gathering created space for honest and sometimes very difficult conversations. Religious women often serve in roles that place them close to vulnerable communities, while also facing their own forms of vulnerability within institutional settings. And this workshop engaged directly with those realities. It explored how abuse can arise in these contexts, how it can be recognized, and how communities can respond. There was also a strong emphasis on resilience. This was approached as a way of strengthening individuals and communities so that they're better equipped to respond and to support one another. Training sessions focused on practical tools while also encouraging the creation of environments where concerns can be raised openly. The ability to speak without fear remains a central element of safeguarding. Progress is evident, though it unfolds in different ways depending on the context. It emerges through agreements, reflection, training, and of course, dialogue. It relies both on institutional structures and human relationships. But perhaps most importantly, these developments show that safeguarding is an ongoing process. It requires attention, adaptation, and a willingness to continue learning. You're listening to Inside Safeguarding. In our next segment, I'll be speaking with Professor Benyam Dawit Mezmur, reflecting on his work and insights following last month's plenary assembly. I'm William Roberts. Thank you for joining me. Now, in the second part of this episode of Inside Safeguarding, we're joined by Professor Benyam Dawit Mezmur, Commission member, Professor of Law at the University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and serving as Chairman of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, bringing extensive experience at both global and regional levels. He's just finished addressing the Spring Plenary Assembly here in Rome, where he spoke about safeguarding challenges and sustainability in the African context. And I'm very grateful to him for letting me drag him away to join us here on the podcast. Professor Mezmur, welcome, and thank you for being with us today.
Thank you.
Now, in your presentation, you emphasize that safeguarding standards must operate within a broader national context. Could you explain to us why safeguarding can't simply be transferred as a universal model, and why cultural, legal, and social realities in African countries must shape how these standards are implemented?
Sure. I think national context plays a very important role. And child safeguarding is related to education, is related to health, is related to the support services, mental health services, is related to the manner in which the law enforcement agencies within a country operate, and so forth, so forth. So it doesn't operate in a vacuum, and tackling it requires quite a number of the other related issues. That's the first point. The second point is also that context matters. Your national and local context matters for any child rights issue, and more so for child safeguarding related issues. I'll give you a few examples. If you're dealing with a country that has a historically embedded harmful traditional practices, that would inevitably have implications on child safeguarding practices in the country. If you're dealing with a country that is a small island country and the topography plays a role in terms of how you're going to be able to roll out services. If you're dealing with a country that is unfortunately experiencing armed conflict or has had instabilities and armed conflict in the past, and you're trying to rebuild from there, that would inevitably have implications on the kind of child safeguarding policies that you will be able to implement effectively. The source of the economic source that you have in a country, for example, if it is cotton, just theoretically thinking, if your major source of foreign income or income is cotton production, there will be a direct link in many countries between cotton production and child labor. If one of your main drivers of your economy is tourism, then that would have an implication from the point of view of child safeguarding, because there will be children that will be at risk of child sexual abuse because of tourism. So all these things play an important role. Two other points that often cross my mind when I think about child safeguarding in national context. The extent to which you are able to generate resources domestically to cater for the services that you need to provide for child safeguarding would have implications. If you are very much dependent on external donors, development agencies, and so forth, as compared to being able to generate the resources domestically, that matters. Over-dependence on external donors for core services, when those donors no longer have the interest or the capacity to support those core services, you'll be left stranded. And that would have implications on your child safeguarding policies. That's one before last. The last one that I think is absolutely important is the culture of impunity that exists within a community also plays its own contribution as far as your child safeguarding. If you have a culture where accountability is important, human dignity is important, human rights are embedded in daily lives, as compared to the opposite, then you have your work cut out for you in the first context to implement child safeguarding policies, as compared to the second scenario where you'll be able to make significant progress because the necessary ingredients are actually already in place. So the national context, generally when you talk about children's rights, your national context has implications, but culture, religion, language, economic status would have implications in terms of how you'll be able to implement them, how quickly you'll be able to implement them, how you identify the entry points to implement them, how you finance it, and also how you can actually set reasonable expectations. Because if your baseline matters, if your baseline is higher, you can expect progress within a short to medium term. But if your baseline is too low, then your expectations will have to be from mid-term to long-term.
You highlight several contextual challenges that affect safeguarding efforts in Africa, including poverty, access to legal services, language barriers, emergency settings. From your perspective, which of these factors most significantly affects the sustainability of safeguarding systems, and why?
Thank you. That's a very complex question, because I don't want to portray, I will be the last person who wants to portray Africa as a monolithic entity. I claim to know around 45, to have physically been there for work-related activities to 45, 46 African countries. I am Ethiopian. At some point, as a young child, I've lived in Tanzania. My father used to be based in Egypt. I've been there quite many times, in Kenya as well. I currently work in South Africa. I have spent 11 years within the African Union, and that has obviously exposed me to the very diverse, beautiful, vibrant continent that we call home. So I don't want to portray Africa as a monolithic entity in this conversation. That's the first point. The second is, obviously, there are a number of generalizations that you can make based on the experience, because we also share quite a lot in common. And I think your second question here relates to a certain extent to your first question. So let me address a few elements here. One is conflict inevitably continues to contribute significantly to the child rights challenge that we face, and child sexual abuse is obviously one of them. Climate change and the effects of climate change definitely contribute, are main drivers to a certain extent, because you have flooding and then the support system collapses. You have drought, then families become very desperate from a child protection. You have instances where child support grants and social protection systems are not fit for purpose for crisis situations, whether it's climate change, whether it's conflict. And those obviously are big drivers. But language also plays a very interesting and important role. Vernacularization is important. Trying to be able to communicate to individuals and communities at their level, in their context, and so forth. And I'll give you one or two examples here. Human rights is not necessarily well-embedded lexicon in communities. If you go to Lokichogyo in the border between South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, you want to have a conversation about human rights. In some local languages, you're not going to be able to find the equivalent of human rights. Okay? So in some contexts, maybe human dignity might be a more suitable word to have that conversation, to communicate the information, to do awareness, and so forth. So language and language barrier-related issues also play an important role in terms of where we want to see ourselves in child safeguarding policies. Now, poverty, without a doubt, is a driver. Earlier, I was talking about the fact that we need to be making differentiations when we talk about lack of resources on the basis of regions. If you look at the Americas, their GDP is around 35 trillion. If you look at Europe, their GDP is around 25 to 30 trillion. If you look at Africa, the GDP is just only 3 trillion. Okay? So poverty is not just only about GDP, because we often talk about multidimensional poverty, but poverty remains one big driver for many of the child safeguarding challenges that we face. Now, those are some of the main contributors that I do believe exist. But I also have to be very cautious because I started by saying generalization. Let me break a little bit some details here. Even though we say that conflict is a huge driver, let me give you an example in relation to the Democratic Republic of Congo. DRC unfortunately faces significant instability challenge, armed conflict. Last year, UNICEF came out with data that said in the first 9 months of 2025, 35,000 children have faced rape and sexual violence in the first 9 months of 2025. Now, when they dug deeper, and they also said that the numbers are increasing, reporting. Now, this is an underestimation, obviously. These are reported cases that we're dealing with. When they looked at the numbers from 2020 to 2023, it has shown 120-something% increase. Now, it's very easy to say this is purely because of the conflict. But when you go and look at the details, even though there are obviously large numbers where the reported cases are coming from parts of the DRC where conflict is happening, Ituri and Kivu and so forth. There are also a number of cases that are reported from parts of the country like Kasai, Kinshasa, that are not directly affected by the conflict, but are also reporting significant numbers of sexual abuse cases. So that differentiation is important. A bit of the look into the details. Now, the other consideration that I do believe for differentiation and disaggregation purposes that needs to be looked at is, even though the child safeguarding challenge that we face on the African continent are predominantly against girls, and make no mistake about it, that's the reality, we cannot ignore the challenge that boys also face. So when you look at data collection, data collection is one challenge. Disaggregated data collection is even a higher challenge. You often get data that actually looks at girls and women. And if you do that at the cost of the boys and the men, particularly the boys, because we're dealing with children here, then you're getting half the picture or part of the picture. So you're not tackling the issue at a comprehensive level. So yes, data is one of the challenges, but disaggregation, not just only on the basis of ages, but also on the basis of sexes is important. So you need to also look at the boys and the challenge that they're facing there. Now, on the basis of ages, let me say a word or two here. It's very easy to say and generalize and say that the awareness raising the information sharing and so forth that we do should target the 14 to 17-year-olds, because the majority of the violations actually happen in that age group. I think that would be a valid statement. But one also needs to realize and say that even though that's the target group, we know of cases when the legislation tightens, when the enforcement becomes every I dotted and every T crossed, when the awareness increases, perpetrators tend to target younger and younger ages. So you also obviously need to look at that. And one doesn't also want to, once again, portray children as a monolithic entity. Because, for instance, children with disabilities, particularly girls with disabilities, face much higher challenge than their boy counterparts. So that's also an important aspect. Maybe two final points here. And because we're talking about data collection and the important role it plays, quite a majority of the data that we have globally, but also on the African continent, is focused on contact-related sexual abuse, sexual violence. But there is also non-contact related sexual abuse and sexual violence. In 2024, when UNICEF came out for the first time, global data also looking at regions on rape and sexual violence, they talked about, I think, 340 million people globally, particularly women and girls, that have been sexually abused while below the age of 18, right? 340 or so million globally. 79 million of those are actually on the African continent. But when you include the non-contact, the online and the bullying, that doesn't happen in a contact setting, but actually predominantly on an online space or on text and so forth, so forth. When you include that, the number grows exponentially. It becomes 650 million. Your initial question, so this is an important context. Your initial question about context. On the African continent, yes, both are important. But the priority that governments, civil society organizations, UN agencies, regional organizations, teachers' unions, and so forth need to pay very close attention to is obviously the contact, sexual abuse and rape context, because that's the priority. As a government, if you want to, if this is again a contextual issue, if you have a country where only 30% or 20% of the population has access to electricity, less so the internet, you obviously won't be doing justice to the issue if you spend a lot of your energy and resources and so forth talking and planning and executing and strategizing around the non-contact one, because your immediate challenge would be the contact one.
Your presentation earlier stressed the importance of risk identification, self-assessment, clear reporting procedures within safeguarding frameworks. In practical terms, what are the biggest obstacles organizations face when trying to move from written policies to effective implementation on the ground?
There are multiple challenges that they face. The easier response would be to say resources. But I'm not one of those people who wants to predominantly walk the line that says the lack of money is the root of all evils. These organizations that are actually operating within the African context, generalizing here again, need to understand that probably in our lifetimes, we're not going to have enough resources for these issues. So the question is, what is it that you can actually do effectively with the limited resources that you actually have? So that, I think, is an important aspect. The second aspect, which I think is important, is acknowledging that we actually have this as a problem. And in some contexts, it's not just only a problem, it's a systemic problem. You would find civil society organizations in general, or even child rights organizations, that do not have a child safeguarding policy, or did not have a child safeguarding policy until recently, or do not have a child safeguarding policy until a crisis breaks out in that specific organization. So that definitely is a significant barrier to move from theory to practice. Thirdly, and this is tied to a certain extent to the resources issue, understanding your local context is important. I often come to an example from South Africa where the Children's Act was being drafted and proposed. The government identified that they would need tens of thousands of new social workers to implement the legislation. Now, in the developed world, maybe countries already have those tens of thousands of social workers. But predominantly in the global south, the part of the world that I come from, they're not easily available. You cannot produce them very easily. South Africa was strategic enough. They started to provide funding to women to study sociology and social work at university. But that was not a short-term plan. That was a mid-term plan. So in these circumstances, you constantly have to ask yourself, what are the already existing community-related structures that I can actually tap into to make the necessary efforts and to move in the right direction to address some of the child safeguarding policies that we face. And there are multiple examples. There are examples from Kenya, where we have the community child protection committees. These are not necessarily professionals. These are religious leaders, traditional leaders. These are teachers. These are nurses, auxiliary social workers, but embedded in the community. These are trusted community members that will work on issues such as early identification. They will work on issues such as referrals, so that the children that have been victimized can benefit from services. They will assist in terms of placing a child that has been sexually abused in temporary care. They will also collaborate with law enforcement officials to make sure that perpetrators are actually held accountable. So now, I just mentioned the community child protection committees in Kenya. We have similar ones in Uganda. SASA is what it's called. We have similar examples on community conversations in Ethiopia. We have examples from Tanzania where you try to tap into the existing structures at the community level, because the notion that says one size fits all might not work for you because of your legal, social, economic, cultural context within which you operate. So that might be one of the barriers that we still have to contend with to move from the theory to the practice. But maybe a final point, because my presentation tries to place a bit of emphasis on sustainability. The current environment within which we operate is an indication of things that will sustain, that will be here for years to come. If you look at the financial situation, and I come back to the Democratic Republic of Congo, UNICEF said in 2024, they had funding for about 40% of the programs that they needed on sexual abuse-related cases. In 2025, they only had funding for 23% of that. I don't know how much funding they have for 2026, but you can safely assume that it's probably less. So if that is the direction that things are moving for these core services that were significantly dependent on external funding, I think it's important for governments, for communities, for trade unions, for teachers' unions, for children themselves to have these conversations to say, how is it that we can actually address this gap? How is it that we can, not in the short term, but at least in the midterm, try to make sure that we tap into resources at the domestic level? Because addressing child safeguarding issues, particularly in the context of sexual abuse, is a core service. The media has a stake, the judicial system has a stake, the national human rights institutions have a stake, children themselves have stakes, communities have stakes, religious organizations have significant stakes. And these issues, we try to tackle them on a daily basis, but I don't think they will be going away in the foreseeable future. So if you have that foresight that you can actually mobilize the resources domestically, that you can empower the role players at the domestic level, in some contexts, look at sexual abuse cases, not just as a criminal justice issue, but also as a public health issue, then you tend to make and move in the right direction that you want to move.
In your concluding remarks, Professor Mezmur, you posed a very powerful question: whether a child born today in Africa is better protected from sexual abuse than a child born decades ago. Based on the trends you see, are we moving in the right direction? And what must change in the next decade or so to ensure that that answer becomes a clear yes?
Thank you. That question, let me do a disclaimer. That question is a reframing of what UNICEF posed in 2015 during the 25th anniversary of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. They posed the question, is a child born today in 2015 better off in terms of rights than a child born in 1989? And I reframed it for the purpose of this presentation. And the answer to that question is yes, we're moving in the right direction, but not for every child, and not in every country, and not in every locality and city and so forth on the African continent. So why not every child? There are still children that are falling between the cracks in our lawmaking, in our policy making, in our programmatic efforts. Children with disabilities is a good example. Children in migration situations is another good example. Children in the context of crisis, for example, in the context of armed conflict, they happen to have a higher level of risk in terms of rape, in terms of sexual violence. So not every child. Discrimination plays a role here. Now, I already mentioned to you about the girls-boys conversation. Significant, in many countries, exclusive focus on girls at the cost of boys. That is also one of the reasons why I would say yes, but not every child, and boys also fall within that category. That's the first one. If you look at countries on the African continent, there are those that are moving generally in the right direction, and there are those that are struggling to move in the right direction. I don't want to name names here, but there are countries that have a very solid legal and policy framework, but because of lack of political will, because of lack of a solid civil society space that promotes advocacy and efforts to push the boundaries, because of lack of proper awareness raising of the children themselves, are struggling to move in the right direction. Patriarchy plays an important role here. As I mentioned, I've been to many African countries, and there still remain countries who, in their books, in their law books, still promote some of those patriarchal systems, where the education system fails to treat boys and girls equally, fails to treat a husband and a wife in a household equally. So those obviously pose challenge, and there are also those very positive ones that are moving in the right direction, where the political leadership is fairly clued up to the issues. They're not just only clued up to the issues when elections are happening, they're clued up to the issues in between elections when they're actually pushing for legislation in parliament, when they're trying to make sure that the allocation of the resources is there, when they're actually entering into cross-border memorandum of understandings so that they can actually address this issue, because in a number of instances they're cross-border. They also have their priorities in place. And I come back to an earlier point that I made, the contact, non-contact one. We definitely, as a continent, should place adequate emphasis on the online aspect of sexual abuse. But I still do maintain and insist that the priority that we should address is the contact, non-online one, the physical. And a final point. For us to move as a continent in the right direction collectively, accountability, prevention is the number one priority, but accountability also needs to play its own role. When organizations have failed in their child safeguarding efforts, they should be held accountable. When individuals have failed in providing leadership, they should be held accountable. Places of worship, places of safety, child care homes, hospitals, and so forth, where these abuses happen, when they happen, there needs to be accountability. So we have to be able to take the prevention, but also accountability lines in parallel. We should emphasize prevention, but accountability also has its own role to play so that we can continue to move in the right direction.
Well, there you have it. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Mezmur, and for providing these very interesting insights.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
That was Professor Benyam Dawit Mezmur speaking to me just after his address at last month's Spring Plenary Assembly. If you'd like to learn more about Professor Mezmur's work with the Commission and our wider mission, please visit us at tutelaminorum.va. You can also subscribe to Inside Safeguarding on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, where future episodes will be published regularly. Thank you for listening. I'm William Roberts. Until next time.